After 30 years of marriage, I thought I knew him better than anyone. Still, when he looked me in the eye and said I was too old for love, the words hit harder than I expected. As the silence stretched, I felt a strange calm, my fingers tightening around the ring he once gave me. While he still thought it was a joke, the weight of his words settled in. That's when I made my decision. He would regret this. I walked out, introduced him to my new life, and watched the smile fade from his face. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence, it lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Maggie moved around the kitchen, carefully setting the table. The soft clink of fine china echoed in the quiet room, a fragile sound against the weight of what was about to unfold. She arranged the plates, placing them just so, trying to hold on to the last remnants of routine. 30 years of dinners, anniversaries, and shared moments. And now, this. She glanced at the clock. Daniel would be late, as usual. Her heart sank as the seconds ticked by. He'd been late to so many things in recent years. Dinner, their daughter's school events, her own milestones. She used to excuse it. But now, the truth sat heavy in her chest. The door creaked open, and the familiar, lingering scent of expensive cologne hit her before he even stepped into the room. His presence filled the space, but it wasn't the same anymore. It felt hollow. Daniel hung his jacket over a chair with a nonchalance that made Maggie's stomach turn. He didn't meet her gaze as he moved to the table, eyes scanning the food she had prepared. His face was unreadable, his movements sharp and mechanical, like they were just going through the motions. Maggie, he started, the sound of her name like an accusation. He didn't sit, didn't even touch the food. Instead, he took a deep breath, as though preparing to say something important. Let's stop pretending. Her stomach clenched. Her hands paused in midair, the silverware suspended as if she were frozen in time. You're... His voice faltered for a moment, then continued. Too old for love now. The words were so blunt, so brutal, they almost didn't register at first. She blinked, trying to process them, but they crashed over her like a wave, drowning everything else in a fog of disbelief. Too old for love? After all these years? After everything they had been through together? He didn't wait for a response, his gaze flicking casually to the food before reaching for his glass of wine. It was as though he had said nothing at all. As though they were still the same couple they had always been. As if she hadn't just been shredded from the inside out. I need someone who still excites me, he added, almost absent-mindedly, as if discussing the weather. Maggie's heart thudded painfully in her chest. The humiliation stung like nothing she had ever felt before. The years, the shared moments, the sacrifices. None of it mattered to him. He needed someone younger. Someone who didn't remind him of his aging body, his fears, his mistakes. Someone who could make him feel powerful again. Maggie felt a surge of something dark and cold inside her, and for a fleeting moment, she imagined what it would feel like to lash out, to scream, to throw something. But she stayed still, her breath shallow, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. This wasn't about her. It wasn't about him either. This was about something much deeper. The end of a chapter. Be grateful, Daniel said as he took another sip of wine, his tone now lazy. Some men just leave. She could feel the anger boiling up from the pit of her stomach, but Maggie kept it contained. The fire inside her kept at bay by sheer will. She wasn't going to beg. She wasn't going to crumble. And some women don't go quietly, Maggie replied, her voice steady, cold. She didn't wait for him to respond. She turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the wooden floor, the sound slicing through the tension that hung in the air. Maggie didn't need to hear him say anything more. She didn't need him to apologize. She had heard enough. The truth was out. It was raw. It was ugly, but it was undeniable. And she wasn't going to pretend anymore. As she stepped into the living room, the weight of the moment pressed down on her. She didn't feel sadness. Not right now. She didn't feel relief either. What she felt was the quiet stirrings of something else. Something that had been buried for far too long. She was done. Maggie moved around the kitchen, her back to him as she methodically placed the plates on the table. Each piece of china felt heavier than the last, her hands trembling with the weight of the silence between them. The air was thick, charged with the aftermath of his words earlier, and she couldn't seem to shake the feeling that something was about to break. She heard him before she saw him, the quiet click of his phone as he tapped away at the screen. His fingers moved quickly, almost like he was trying to avoid looking up. Maggie tried to focus on the task in front of her, but her gaze drifted over, just for a moment, and she caught sight of it. A lipstick stain. Not hers. The deep red smear was unmistakable, fresh against the collar of his shirt. It was bold, unapologetic. The evidence of his betrayal, right there, in plain sight. Her heart skipped, the air in the room thickening as Maggie's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to look away, but she couldn't. It was a brutal reminder. He was already with someone else, already slipping away. Without a word, Daniel continued scrolling through his phone, his face flickering with a smile as he read something, oblivious to the storm brewing just a few feet away. He didn't even seem to notice the mark on his collar. He was too busy living his new life while she stood frozen, unable to move. "Guess I'll be traveling more," he said, his voice light, almost dismissive. "Business trips, client meetings, you know how it is." He said it like it was just part of the routine, like he hadn't just shattered the last remnants of their life together. Traveling more? Of course. Maggie swallowed the sharp ache that rose in her chest. She had known it was coming, the affair. But hearing it spoken so casually, so flippantly, made the wound feel deeper. "Is she worth throwing away 30 years?" Maggie asked, her voice coming out colder than she expected. Daniel didn't look up immediately. He kept scrolling, his fingers swiping across the screen with practiced ease. It was like he was enjoying the moment, savoring it. Finally, he glanced at her, his eyes holding no remorse, only indifference. "30 years made you comfortable and boring," he said with a shrug, his words landing like a slap. "You got too settled, Maggie. Too easy." Her hands clenched at her sides, the sting of his words cutting deeper than she expected. He had reduced her to something simple, something unworthy of his attention, and the anger bubbled up inside her. But she kept it contained, breathing through it, refusing to let him see the chaos he'd just unleashed. Maggie's fingers gripped the edge of the countertop, her palms slick with tension. Inside, something cold and hard began to take root. She wasn't sure if it was rage or something more final. But she knew one thing for certain. This was the end. This was how it all unraveled. She didn't say anything else. There was nothing left to say. Turning away, she made her way to the living room, her steps slow but deliberate. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she hesitated only for a moment before pulling it out. Olivia. Her daughter. Maggie's fingers hovered over the screen before typing out a simple message. "I need to talk. Now." She pressed send before she could second-guess herself. It felt like a small victory, something she could still control in the midst of the chaos. She didn't look back at Daniel, even as she heard him shuffle behind her, moving into the next room. She was done. Done with him, done with the lies, and done with being the one left behind. Maggie knew Olivia would understand. She always did. Maggie's phone buzzed again, this time with urgency. Her pulse quickened when she saw Olivia's name flash across the screen. Her daughter had already received the message, and Maggie could feel the storm approaching. The first of many aftershocks of Daniel's betrayal. The door to the house creaked open, and Maggie didn't need to look up to know it was Olivia. She could feel the tension in the air, heavy and thick, like the humidity of Savannah outside. A second later, Olivia stormed into the living room, her face flushed with fury. "How could he?" Olivia spat, her voice sharp and trembling with anger. "How could he say that to you? How could he—" Her words faltered as she threw her arms up, pacing the room. "I can't even look at him. He's disgusting." Maggie watched her daughter, her heart aching as she saw the same rage that had surged through her moments ago. Olivia was a reflection of her anger raw and visceral. But Maggie had learned something her daughter hadn't yet: how to control it. "I know," Maggie said quietly, the weight of her own words sinking in. "I know, sweetheart. I can't believe it either." Olivia stopped pacing and turned to face her eyes wide with disbelief. "But Mom, it's not just what he said. I saw his Instagram, his work trips. They're all lies. He's with her. That woman." Maggie's breath caught in her throat as Olivia threw her phone onto the coffee table. The screen flashed with a photo of Daniel, smiling wide in front of some hotel, his arm wrapped around a younger woman. It was the same woman Maggie had noticed on his phone the other day, the one who had no place in their life. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. "Look at this," Olivia continued, her voice cracking. "Look at the dates. He's been with her all this time, and he hasn't even bothered to cover it up. No shame, nothing." Maggie felt her chest tighten, the hollow ache spreading inside her. The truth was worse than she'd imagined. It wasn't just the affair. It was the complete disregard for everything they had built. The life, the family, the years. He had already moved on. "I should have known," Olivia whispered, her hands trembling as she ran them through her hair. "We take him apart, piece by piece. We—" "No," Maggie interrupted softly but firmly, the words cutting through Olivia's fire. "We don't fight emotionally. We fight intelligently." Olivia met her gaze, confused. "What do you mean?" "He deserves to be destroyed. He needs to feel everything, every bit of the pain he's caused." Maggie shook her head slowly, her voice steady now, as if the storm inside her had settled into something far more calculated. "We're not going to destroy him, Olivia. We're going to take everything from him. But we'll do it carefully. No emotion, no drama. We're going to make him pay, but we'll make sure it's done the right way." Olivia opened her mouth to protest, but Maggie cut her off with a sharp look, the decision already made in her mind. She was no longer the woman who had been left behind, the one begging for scraps of affection. She was someone else now, someone stronger. Maggie stood, pulling her phone from her pocket. I'm calling Rose." The name made Olivia hesitate. "Rose Calder?" Maggie nodded, her fingers already moving over the screen. "She's the best, and if Daniel wants out of this marriage, we're going to make sure he pays for every second." The phone rang twice before Rose's voice came through the line, smooth and confident. "Maggie, what's going on? I was hoping to hear from you." Maggie's chest tightened as she looked at Olivia. "He's done, Rose. I need to take the first step. He's not just walking away, he's going to pay. And I need you to help me make sure that happens." On the other end, Rose paused for just a moment, then responded in the same measured, calm tone that had always made Maggie feel like everything was under control. "If he wants out, we'll make sure he doesn't get away with it. Every last thing will be accounted for." "You have my word." Maggie ended the call and turned back to Olivia, whose eyes were still burning with anger, but now tempered with a little more clarity. "We don't just take him apart, Olivia," Maggie said quietly, but with a certainty that made her daughter stop. "We take everything. We make sure he knows what he's lost." Olivia nodded, the anger now shifting into something deeper, something more purposeful. She had always admired her mother's strength, but now, for the first time, she saw it for what it truly was, a force to be reckoned with. Maggie pushed open the door to her home, her arms full of groceries. She'd spent the last hour in the sweltering heat of Savannah, running errands to keep her mind busy. The weight of the day's decisions, her conversation with Rose, the first step toward reclaiming what Daniel had so carelessly thrown away, pressed heavily on her. She just needed a moment of normalcy, a few minutes of peace before the next wave of this nightmare hit. She didn't expect the scene that greeted her as soon as she stepped inside. The sound of laughter, soft, light, almost musical, echoed from the kitchen. A high, feminine laugh. Tessa's laugh. Maggie's stomach twisted, the warmth of the groceries suddenly feeling heavy against her chest. She set the bags down quickly, the contents rattling as she moved toward the kitchen. And there she was, Tessa, standing in Maggie's kitchen, wearing her robe. The robe Daniel had bought for her on their last anniversary. The robe she had worn on their first morning together in their new house. The robe that held so many memories of a life Maggie had thought was safe and steady. And now, there was Tessa, the woman who had been stealing everything from her. Tessa turned, a wide, almost smug smile spreading across her face as she caught Maggie's eye. Her posture was loose, casual, like she owned the space. "Daniel said you wouldn't mind," she said, her voice light, almost mocking. Maggie's vision went white for a moment, a burst of humiliation and anger blinding her. The words hit harder than she expected. The audacity, the arrogance. Tessa didn't even have the decency to feel guilty. She was standing there, in Maggie's home, in Maggie's robe, as if she belonged. Maggie's breath caught, and she felt a wave of nausea rise from the pit of her stomach. She wanted to scream, to tear the woman apart, but she couldn't. Not yet. Not until it was the right time. Tessa stood there, her smile never faltering as she folded her arms. "He deserves a woman who still looks alive," she said, her eyes flicking down Maggie's form in a way that made the bile rise in Maggie's throat. The words were intended to sting, and they did. But beneath that sting, Maggie could feel something else, something colder, sharper. Maggie's hands clenched at her sides, and she took a slow, steadying breath. This woman, this child, thought she had won. She thought she had won everything: Daniel, the house, the life Maggie had worked for. But Maggie wasn't the same woman who had stood by quietly, watching her marriage slip away. Maggie's eyes flicked over Tessa once more, her gaze lingering on the way Tessa's smirk barely hid her bruising arrogance. Maggie silently took note of everything: the posture, the attitude, the way Tessa's eyes dared her to react. It was all a weapon, one Maggie could use later when the time was right. Before she could respond, Daniel's voice echoed from the hallway. "Maggie, you home?" He entered the kitchen, his arm casually draped around Tessa's shoulders. He looked at Maggie, his eyes wide in surprise, as if it were entirely normal to walk into his wife's house with his mistress in tow. "Hey," he said, sounding almost too casual. "We're just hanging out. Tessa was telling me about her new job and—" He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes shifting nervously between Maggie and Tessa, as if unsure what kind of reaction he would get. Maggie didn't flinch. She stood still, her hands still shaking slightly, but the fury inside her was now ice cold. She could feel the heat of the moment, but she kept her face composed, every muscle in her body locked down. "Thank you," Maggie said quietly, her voice low but steady. Tessa blinked, clearly thrown off guard by Maggie's calmness. "For what?" she asked, genuinely confused. Maggie stepped forward, her eyes never leaving Tessa's. "For showing me exactly what I needed to see." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. It was a quiet declaration, but one that spoke volumes. Maggie wasn't the woman she had been when she had found out about the affair. She wasn't the woman who had begged for scraps of affection. She was stronger now, and she knew exactly how to play this game. Tessa's smile faltered for just a second before she straightened, her confidence returning. But Maggie had already seen it, the crack in the armor. Daniel shifted uncomfortably behind her, glancing back and forth between the two women. The moment was heavy with unspoken tension. But Maggie, for the first time in a long while, felt like she was the one in control. "Enjoy yourselves," Maggie said, her voice dripping with a calm, almost sardonic sweetness. "I'll be upstairs." She turned on her heel, not waiting for a response. As she climbed the stairs, the weight of the moment settled into her bones. This was the beginning of something new, a new chapter, a new path. One where Daniel and his new life would be nothing but a distant memory. The sharp click of Maggie's heels on the marble floor echoed through the law office. She hadn't been able to shake the image of Tessa in her robe, or the way Daniel's voice had faltered when he realized Maggie wasn't the woman he thought she was anymore. But as the door to Rose's office closed behind her, a new storm loomed on the horizon, the one Rose had promised to uncover. Rose was already sitting at her desk, flipping through a pile of documents. She looked up as Maggie entered, offering her a tight, knowing smile. "Come in, Maggie," she said, gesturing to the chair in front of her desk. "I've got some things to show you." Maggie sank into the seat, her mind already bracing for what she might hear. Rose had been digging into Daniel's finances, hoping to find something, anything that could tip the scales in Maggie's favor. Rose pulled a thick stack of papers toward her and began flipping through them methodically. "I didn't expect this," Rose said, her voice low. "But I think it's time you knew. Your husband is nearly bankrupt." Maggie froze, the words hanging in the air like a punch to the gut. "What?" Her voice was barely a whisper, but the disbelief was evident in her eyes. "His business is failing," Rose continued, her eyes scanning the documents in front of her. "He's been trying to keep it together, borrowing from various sources. Tessa thinks he's wealthy, that he's got this fortune that'll carry her into a life of luxury. But the reality? Not so much." Maggie leaned forward, the weight of the information sinking in. For years, Daniel had paraded around like he was untouchable, pretending like he was in control of everything. But the truth was far darker than she'd expected. "He's drained his savings, taken out loans in your name," Rose said, her tone not unkind but matter-of-fact. "The house, the pension, everything you've worked for, it's all on the line now." Maggie's mind whirled. All those years of making sacrifices, of standing by Daniel's side through his ups and downs, and this was what he'd done in return? He'd put it all in jeopardy, and for what? Tessa? A younger woman who was nothing more than a leech? Her heart pounded as the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. "Then he needs me," Maggie murmured, her voice steady, even though the revelation hit like a tidal wave. "He's clinging to me, pretending he doesn't need me, but he does. He needs me to hold everything together." Rose looked up, her eyebrows raised, a slow smile forming on her lips. "Exactly. And if he tries to divorce you, he loses everything. The house, the pension, everything. You hold every card, Maggie." Maggie's fingers tightened into a fist at her side, her nails biting into her palm. She had known it, deep down, the way he'd dismissed her so easily, thinking he could walk away unscathed. But now she had the upper hand, and she was going to make him feel every second of it. "I don't need to fight him emotionally," Maggie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll just let him walk right into the trap. Let him think he's won. Let him think he can take what he wants. I'll watch him tear it all down himself." Rose's eyes gleamed with approval. "You're smarter than you give yourself credit for, Maggie. This isn't about playing fair. It's about playing the game." Maggie stood, her resolve hardening like steel. Then it's time to end the game. Maggie's heart didn't race. It didn't even skip a beat. She stood there, calm and collected, as if the man she had spent 30 years with had never mattered. And in a way, he no longer did. Not when he had proven that he was willing to throw it all away for a brief affair. Maggie knew the trial separation would be Daniel's choice, not hers. But the moment he offered it, she would accept with zero resistance. She would let him think he was in control, let him think he could walk away from her. But deep down, Maggie knew he had nothing. And when the dust settled, it would be her that had the power to decide how everything played out. A few hours later, she returned home to find Daniel sitting in the living room, his posture as casual as ever. The faint smell of Tessa's perfume still lingered in the air. Maggie could feel the weight of the moment, the choices that hung in the balance. Daniel looked up from his phone, his eyes narrowing slightly as he noticed Maggie's calm demeanor. "We need to talk," he said, his voice flat, as if this conversation was just another item on his to-do list. Maggie took a deep breath, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. She met his gaze head-on, her voice steady and cold. "I'm ready." But what Daniel didn't know was that this conversation was about to change everything. The morning sunlight streamed through the window as Maggie stood before the mirror, her hands trembling slightly as she studied her reflection. The woman staring back at her was unfamiliar, but in a way, she had been there all along, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Her once familiar brown hair, the same shade she'd worn for years, now fell in layers, freshly cut and styled with a precision that felt almost foreign. The mirror reflected a woman she barely recognized, but was beginning to understand. She was no longer the woman who waited, who endured. She was someone else now. Someone stronger. She stood up straight, shoulders squared, as if the weight of 30 years of marriage had been lifted. The posture felt different, more confident, more assertive. She no longer slouched, as though carrying the burden of Daniel's disinterest on her back. No. Now, she stood tall. Maggie surveyed her new wardrobe, a mix of sleek, tailored pieces and soft, confident colors. A far cry from the faded, practical outfits she'd worn in her life as Daniel's wife. She had spent hours selecting new pieces for herself, outfits that made her feel like she was reclaiming her own identity. But it wasn't just the physical transformation. Maggie had begun to change her mindset too. She had started attending a grief support group, a place where others shared their stories of loss. It was an ironic kind of comfort, seeing people in pain just like her, trying to heal and find their way. And there, in that group, Maggie found something more than just shared sorrow. It was there that she met Dr. Adrian Locke. He was a psychologist, grounded and thoughtful, with a quiet charisma that made him stand out. He was different from the arrogant, self-centered men she had known. Adrian didn't try to impress or dominate the conversation. Instead, he listened. He asked questions that dug deeper. Questions Maggie had never thought to ask herself. Adrian's insight was sharp, and it didn't take long before he noticed Maggie's emotional intelligence. She wasn't just trying to move on, she was learning to live again, to thrive, to rediscover who she was without Daniel. He saw past the surface to the woman beneath, the one who had buried her strength for too long. "You're stronger than you think, Maggie," Adrian had said one afternoon, his voice low and assured. "You've always been. Now, you're just letting yourself see it." She smiled at the memory, feeling a warmth inside that had been absent for so long. Adrian didn't just make her feel understood, he made her feel seen. A few days later, Maggie was returning home from the support group, a quiet sense of satisfaction wrapping around her like a soft blanket. She had been feeling stronger, more herself than she had in ages. She was looking forward to a quiet evening, alone, to relax and think. But as she opened the door to her house, she froze. There, standing in the living room, was Daniel. His eyes narrowed as he looked at her, his posture stiffening when he saw what she was wearing. Maggie's new clothes, her new look, the transformation he hadn't seen coming. He stared at her for a long moment before scoffing, breaking the silence with the words she had been expecting but still felt sharp in her chest. "Who are you trying to impress?" His voice was dismissive, cold. Maggie's heart fluttered briefly with the rush of emotion that had been buried under layers of hurt, anger, and humiliation. But this time, the anger was quiet, contained, calm. She looked him straight in the eyes, her voice steady and cool. "Someone who isn't ashamed of being seen with me." For a brief moment, Daniel's eyes flickered. His face remained neutral, but there was a brief flash of something else there. Regret, perhaps, or maybe confusion. He was looking at her as though he couldn't quite understand who this woman was. This woman who stood before him like she had no need for his approval, his validation. Maggie didn't wait for his response. She simply turned on her heel and walked upstairs, the sound of her footsteps loud against the silence that followed her. For the first time in years, Maggie felt like she was truly in control. And Daniel? Well, he wasn't sure yet how to handle the new Maggie, but he would learn. Maggie sat in the living room, the house feeling quieter, as if it had finally settled after the storm. Daniel's movements had grown more erratic in the past few days, his frustration becoming impossible to ignore. He paced back and forth, phone clutched tightly in his hand. Maggie's eyes flickered up from her book, watching him carefully. She could tell something had shifted. The air in the house now felt thick with tension. He threw the phone down onto the table, his voice cutting through the silence. "Tessa's asking for things I can't give her," Daniel muttered, the weight of the admission settling between them. "She wants a necklace from that boutique, the one I said I couldn't afford." Maggie remained calm, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of her book. "And what are you going to do about it?" she asked, her voice unbothered. He ran a hand through his thinning hair. "What do you mean?" "I'm doing everything I can." "But the business is failing, and she's—" He stopped, the frustration building in his voice. Maggie set the book down slowly, standing up with deliberate calm. "You picked this, Daniel. You picked her. You picked the life that comes with it." His face flushed with anger. "If you'd been more exciting, more alive," he snapped, "this wouldn't have happened." Her gaze was unwavering. She stepped closer, her voice steady. "You picked your misery. Live in it." Daniel flinched, the words hitting harder than he'd expected. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. For a moment, he just stood there, staring at her as if trying to make sense of the woman standing in front of him. Maggie didn't wait for him to respond. She turned and walked toward the kitchen. Olivia was at the counter, scrolling through her phone, when Maggie entered. Her daughter looked up with a slight smile, her eyes soft with concern. "You okay?" Olivia asked. Maggie nodded, her shoulders relaxing. "I'm fine. He's blaming me again, but I'm fine." Olivia's expression hardened. "I don't care what he says. I'm with you." Maggie's chest tightened, a soft smile pulling at her lips. "I know, sweetie." That night, Maggie sat in the living room again, the weight of the day lifting slightly. Her phone buzzed. A message from Adrian. "Hope your day held some joy." Maggie's heart warmed at the simple, thoughtful gesture. For the first time in days, she smiled. Truly smiled. She typed back. "It did. Thank you." The section ends with Maggie finding a moment of peace through Adrian's message, signaling a subtle but powerful shift in her emotional landscape. Maggie stood in the kitchen, the weight of the day's tension hanging in the air. The house felt quieter, as though even the walls were holding their breath. Daniel had been distant lately, his movements increasingly erratic. She hadn't expected it to escalate this quickly. The sharp sound of the front door opening broke the silence, and Maggie felt her stomach tighten. Daniel's voice echoed from the hallway. "Tessa's moving in," he said, his words flat and matter-of-fact, as if it were just another mundane detail of the day. Maggie's hand froze over the counter, the knife she had been holding still midair. She set it down slowly, turning to face him. "What?" "Tessa," Daniel repeated, his eyes avoiding hers as if it wasn't even worth the discomfort. "She wants to move in. It's time." Maggie's gaze hardened, but her voice remained calm, almost detached. "You're kidding, right?" "No," Daniel said, his voice tight. "It's happening. I'm done pretending with you. She wants to be here, and I'm making it happen." Maggie blinked, her heart sinking, but she didn't react the way he probably expected. "And what about me?" Her voice remained steady, but underneath, there was a simmering anger she didn't let escape. Daniel hesitated for a moment, finally meeting her eyes. "You can leave, or—" He trailed off, clearly unsure how to finish the sentence. Her mind raced, but she didn't allow herself to get swept up in the emotion. She'd been preparing for this. For months, she had been silently bracing for the day when he'd stop pretending. And now it was here. "I'm not leaving," Maggie said simply. She folded her arms across her chest, her posture confident, as if she were taking up space in a room that used to feel too small for her. Daniel thrust a pile of papers toward her, the corners of the documents sharp and cold. "Sign these," he said curtly, his face hard. "Transfer papers. Tessa's moving in, and I need you to make it official." Maggie took the papers without hesitation, her eyes scanning them quickly. She could see the words, but she knew they meant nothing. They were meaningless. So, without flinching, she signed them. But not the real ones. The papers were decoys, created by Rose, hidden among the legitimate documents. Maggie handed them back to Daniel without a second thought. He barely looked at them before grabbing them and turning to Tessa, who was standing in the doorway, watching them both with an almost smug expression. Tessa didn't wait for an invitation. She began to move toward the closet, already gathering Maggie's things as though she had every right. Clothes were thrown into trash bags, personal belongings tossed aside. Maggie stood still, not a hint of panic or emotion crossing her face. She had prepared for this moment, this show of power from Tessa. But what Tessa didn't realize was that this wasn't her home. Not anymore. As Tessa continued her mindless destruction, Maggie's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her heart lightening just a fraction when she saw the message from Adrian. "You sound tense. Need company?" Maggie's lips curved into a small smile, the first real smile she'd had in days. She was no longer that woman who needed to hide her tears. She was ready for what was coming next. She typed back, "Yes, but not the kind you think." The sound of Daniel calling Tessa's name in the other room snapped Maggie's attention back to the present. She looked at the chaos unfolding before her, but this time, she didn't feel helpless. She was in control. And Daniel? He was walking into his own trap, blind to the fact that he'd already lost everything. Maggie sat in Rose's office, the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights above almost drowned out by the pounding in her ears. Her fingers drummed nervously on the tabletop, but she didn't let herself show how anxious she felt. Not when Rose was on the verge of revealing something that could change everything. "Here it is," Rose said softly, pushing a file across the desk. She gave Maggie a look, serious, heavy with the weight of what they'd uncovered. "Tessa Monroe. We found some things." Maggie leaned forward, her heart racing as she flipped open the folder. It was like she was peeling back layers of a life she hadn't wanted to know about. She scanned the pages quickly, eyes catching the words that made her stomach twist. Fraud, identity theft, extortion. Tessa had a criminal record, one Maggie had never imagined. She's done this before, Rose said quietly, her tone cold. To other men. Older, wealthier men. She manipulates them, builds their trust, then destroys them. And it's all the same pattern. Maggie sat back, the information landing like a blow to the chest. She had known something wasn't right. But this? This was worse than she'd ever thought. Daniel hadn't just been seduced. He'd been targeted. Her mind raced as she read on, her fingers gripping the edge of the folder. Tessa had a history of taking from men who were vulnerable, men like Daniel, who were willing to trust, to believe in something that was never real. She was a predator, and Daniel was the latest in her sights. God, Maggie whispered, her heart sinking. He wasn't just seduced. He was prey. Rose nodded, her expression grim. And Tessa's already planned her next move. She's not just looking to live with him. She wants to marry him. She wants the house, the pension, everything. Maggie's head spun. It wasn't just an affair. It wasn't even about love. Tessa was after everything Maggie had spent 30 years building. I should have seen it, Maggie said, the words thick with disbelief. She's been using him the whole time. Rose leaned forward, her voice low and sharp. We could go after them. Destroy them both. Take everything she's ever worked for. You'd get full custody of the assets. We can make them pay, Maggie. Maggie's eyes locked onto Rose's, but there was something cold in her voice when she spoke. No, I don't want to destroy them. Her gaze never wavered. I want them to destroy each other. Rose blinked, taken aback by the sudden shift in Maggie's tone. But Maggie wasn't just talking about revenge. She was talking about control. Control over her life, her future, and the twisted relationship Daniel and Tessa had built. Maggie stood slowly, her fingers brushing over the file before she placed it back on the table. I've got a plan. Rose raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What are you thinking? Maggie pulled out her phone and quickly typed a message. She didn't hesitate, didn't second-guess herself. She found Tessa's criminal record in the system and, with one swift motion, attached it to an email. She sent it, anonymously, directly to Daniel's inbox. The subject line was simple, blunt. The truth about Tessa. Maggie set her phone down, her expression unreadable. She wasn't going to be the one to chase after them. Not anymore. She wasn't going to beg for Daniel's love or his attention. She had already seen the truth. I want him to know what he's really dealing with, Maggie said softly, her voice steady. Let him read it. Let him decide what to do next. Rose nodded slowly, her smile tight but approving. This will be interesting. Maggie stood in the quiet office for a moment, the weight of the decision settling in. She had just set something in motion, something that would shake the foundation of Daniel's world. And Tessa? She would learn that nothing was ever as easy as it seemed. The front door slammed open with a violent force that shook the house. Daniel stormed in, his face flushed with anger, his fists clenched at his sides. He had driven back from Tessa's place, the weight of his emotions pressing down on him like a lead balloon. His heart pounded in his chest, the realization of what had just happened sinking in. Maggie didn't even have to look up from where she was standing at the kitchen counter. She knew what had transpired. She had set this in motion. She could feel the storm before it even broke. He stood there, in the doorway, gasping for breath, a mixture of rage and humiliation painted on his face. She lied to me, Daniel growled, his voice barely more than a hoarse whisper. She's not who I thought she was. Maggie turned slowly, the barest hint of a smile tugging at her lips. She didn't respond immediately, letting the silence stretch between them. The weight of his words hung in the air, his realization that he had been played finally hitting him. I confronted her, Daniel continued, his eyes wild with confusion and anger. She denied it all. She turned everything back on me. She said I was crazy, that I was too old to keep up with her. His fists clenched tighter. And then she had the nerve to say, "Better than your dusty wife." Maggie finished for him, her voice cold and calm. Daniel's eyes flashed with surprise. "You knew?" "I knew," she said simply, her eyes steady, betraying no emotion. She stepped closer to him, her posture calm but unwavering. "She's been using you, Daniel. You weren't her lover. You were just another man to drain. And now, you see it. Now you know what you've done." The words stung him like nothing else, cutting deeper than anything Tessa had said. He opened his mouth to argue, to defend himself, but the truth was choking him. "I gave her everything," he murmured, more to himself than to Maggie. "I trusted her." Maggie folded her arms across her chest, her eyes never leaving his. "And look where that's gotten you." Daniel's face twisted with frustration. His voice was strained as he stepped forward. "Maggie, I made a mistake." His voice wavered slightly. "I see it now. I was a fool. I thought I could be happy. But she's nothing like you." Maggie felt a slight tremor in her chest at the sound of his voice, the weight of his words. There had been a time when she would have begged him to say those things, but not anymore. She was done. She took a deep breath, her gaze cool and steady. "I've already moved forward, Daniel." His face went pale as her words hit him. She saw the recognition in his eyes. The moment when he realized that it wasn't just his marriage that was over. It was everything. "You've moved forward?" he repeated, his voice breaking. "What does that mean?" Maggie stood tall, not giving an inch. "It means I'm not coming back to this. I'm done with your lies, your betrayal, your manipulation." Daniel stumbled back, his eyes darting to the floor, unable to look her in the eye. The weight of his actions pressed in on him, suffocating him. "Please," he whispered, the desperation in his voice unmistakable. "Please, Maggie, take me back. I can fix this. I'll do anything." But Maggie didn't waver. She didn't feel sorry for him anymore. The woman who had once cried herself to sleep, praying for him to change, was gone. The woman standing before him now was stronger, clearer, and far beyond the lies he'd told. "No, Daniel," she said, her voice resolute. "You made your choice. And now, you'll have to live with it." The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel stood there, broken, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Maggie stood tall, her heart calm for the first time in ages. She wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking forward, to her life, to her future, to the new path she had already begun walking. Maggie stood at the entrance of the small fundraising event, the soft hum of conversation and clinking glasses filling the air. She could feel the weight of the evening, a quiet sense of liberation settling in as Adrian stood beside her. The walls of the venue were adorned with local art, and the soft lights gave the room a warm, welcoming atmosphere. But it wasn't just the room that felt different. It was her. She wasn't the woman she had been. Not anymore. Adrian's presence was like a breath of fresh air. Calm, composed, attentive. Everything Daniel had never been. As they moved through the crowd, Adrian listened intently to the conversations, his focus entirely on whoever he was speaking to. He didn't need to dominate the room. His respect and quiet confidence made people gravitate toward him. Maggie couldn't help but admire how easily he moved in the world, how naturally he made people feel comfortable. He was nothing like Daniel. "You okay?" Adrian asked, glancing at Maggie with a small smile. His eyes were warm, concerned, but not overbearing. He genuinely cared. And for the first time in ages, Maggie felt like someone was truly present with her. Maggie smiled, the first real smile she'd worn in weeks. "I'm better than okay," she replied softly, her voice a little breathless with the realization. "It's nice to be here, to be me again." Adrian chuckled, a quiet sound that only deepened the connection between them. "I'm glad you're here. You deserve this." As they moved toward the bar, Maggie's eyes flicked to the other side of the room. Her heart skipped when she saw him. Daniel. His eyes locked with hers from across the room, and the color drained from his face. Maggie saw the immediate shift, the way he stiffened, his body language betraying a mixture of surprise, guilt, and perhaps a flicker of panic. Daniel had no idea what to do with himself now. She could feel his eyes darting between her and Adrian, and she stood taller, unbothered, as if her body itself was a statement. Adrian didn't seem to notice Daniel's presence, his focus still on Maggie. But Daniel's gaze never left her. It wasn't long before Daniel started to move toward them. As he approached, Maggie felt a sense of calm settle over her. He was no longer the man who could dictate her emotions. Now, he was just a figure from her past. She didn't need his approval. She didn't need anything from him anymore. "Maggie," Daniel said, his voice cracking as he stood before her. His eyes flickered nervously to Adrian, who remained steady beside her. "We need to talk." Maggie didn't react, not at first. She simply met his gaze, cool and unfazed. Then she spoke, her voice as clear as ever. "What do you want, Daniel?" Before he could answer, Tessa entered the room, her heels clicking loudly on the floor. She came in with her usual arrogance, eyes searching for Daniel. The moment she saw him standing with Maggie and Adrian, her face twisted with irritation. "What the hell is this?" Tessa snapped, crossing the room toward them. "Daniel, you're embarrassing me." Maggie didn't flinch. Instead, she simply smiled faintly, watching Tessa as she marched up to Daniel, her fury obvious. Daniel looked from Maggie to Tessa, visibly shaken. "Don't embarrass me in front of them, Maggie," he pleaded, his voice barely above a whisper. Maggie's gaze never wavered. "You embarrassed yourself the day you called me too old for love." The words were soft, but final. Tessa's face turned a deeper shade of red, but Maggie didn't care. Adrian's presence was like a shield, calm and solid against the chaos Tessa was trying to stir up. As if sensing the moment, Adrian placed a gentle but protective hand on Maggie's back. Daniel flinched at the touch. His entire body stiffened, and for the first time in a long while, Maggie saw a crack in his facade. He wasn't the man who had discarded her anymore. He was just a man, vulnerable and desperate. Maggie felt a quiet satisfaction wash over her. This moment, this victory, was her own. The night was eerily still as Maggie stood in the living room, the faint buzz of her phone breaking the silence. She glanced down, seeing the bank alert notification. Her heart skipped when she opened it. Tessa had drained Daniel's account. Every last dollar. A cold, quiet satisfaction washed over Maggie. She had known this would happen, but seeing it in black and white was a sharp reminder of just how deep Daniel's blind trust had run. Tessa hadn't just been after his body. She had been after everything. Her eyes flicked to the front door, a sudden tension building in the pit of her stomach. A faint sound echoed from the hallway, followed by a soft knock. Maggie's mind shifted from the text to the sound outside. She didn't need to guess who it was. Daniel. The door creaked open without him saying a word, his broken form standing in the entryway. His clothes were disheveled, his face drawn and pale, eyes filled with humiliation. His hands were trembling as he reached out to her, his voice hoarse with desperation. "Please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Please, Maggie, let me in." Maggie didn't respond immediately, her gaze steady. She had nothing left to say to him. He had already made his choices, and now he had to live with them. "Please," Daniel repeated, voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what to do. She took everything. She left me with nothing." The words hung heavy between them. Maggie took a moment before stepping aside, opening the door slightly, just enough for him to see her standing there. He stood frozen, watching her with a mixture of disbelief and regret, his chest rising and falling with shaky breaths. Maggie's expression remained calm, but inside, she felt a quiet strength grow. "You signed these," she said softly, handing him the stack of divorce papers she had prepared. "You agreed to them weeks ago." Daniel's hand shook as he reached for the papers, his face draining of color. He didn't even have to open them. The realization struck him in that moment. The papers weren't just for a divorce. They were for everything. The house, the assets, the life he had thought he could leave behind. He had signed it all away. "What? What is this?" he gasped, his voice faltering. Maggie stood still, her arms crossed, watching him with a quiet sense of satisfaction. "You gave everything away, Daniel. You were so blinded by Tessa that you didn't realize what you were losing." His eyes darted between the papers and her face, his confusion giving way to panic. "No, no, I didn't mean it," he stammered, his voice pleading. "I didn't mean for this to happen." Maggie's gaze never wavered. "But it did. You let her take everything, and now, you'll have to live with it." The silence stretched between them. Daniel was shaking, the weight of his own actions sinking in. But Maggie wasn't done. "Olivia's watching," she said softly. "She's inside. She's proud of me for finally standing up for myself." Daniel stumbled back, looking as though he had just been hit. His face twisted with frustration, but his voice barely rose above a whisper. "Maggie, please." But Maggie had nothing left to give. The woman who had cried herself to sleep, begging for his love, was gone. The woman standing before him now was calm, resolute. "You lost a wife, Daniel," she said quietly. "And you lost the only person who ever truly loved you." Without waiting for a response, Maggie turned and walked into the other room. She knew there was nothing left to say. The moment was over. Through the window she could see Daniel standing there, broken and alone, as Olivia watched from inside the house, her pride and support clear in the way she stood beside her mother. Maggie had already moved forward. Daniel's world was crashing down, but Maggie's was finally beginning to rise. The afternoon sun cast a soft glow over the town square as Maggie and Adrian walked side by side, the buzz of the crowd around them almost a blur. Maggie felt a lightness she hadn't known in years. For the first time in so long, she wasn't thinking about what she'd lost. She was finally embracing what she had gained. And Adrian's quiet support had made all the difference. As they reached a small bench, Adrian paused, turning to her with a look that made her stop too. There was something in his eyes, something more than just the warmth she had grown accustomed to. It was deeper, almost like he was preparing to say something important. "Maggie," he began, his voice soft but sure, "there's something I've never told you, something I've been meaning to say." She turned to face him, a faint smile on her lips. "What is it?" Adrian's gaze held hers steadily. "I was the anonymous donor who funded your support group." Maggie blinked in surprise, a moment of silence passing between them. "You? Why didn't you say anything before?" Adrian gave a small smile, almost self-deprecating. "Because it wasn't about me. It was about you. I noticed you, long before you noticed me. I saw your strength, even when you didn't see it yourself." The words hit her with a force she hadn't expected. Adrian, the man standing beside her now, had been quietly watching her, supporting her without her even knowing. She thought back to those early days, the confusion and pain she had felt, and she realized that Adrian had always seen her for more than just the woman who had been left behind. Maggie felt something stir inside her, a vulnerability she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. "I don't know what to say," she murmured, overwhelmed by the depth of his words. Adrian gently squeezed her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. You don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to know that I didn't fall for you because you were hurt. I fell for you because you healed." Maggie's breath caught in her throat. His words were gentle, but they pierced through the layers of pain and walls she'd built. She had always feared that she was defined by her scars, by the brokenness Daniel had left behind. But Adrian, he had seen beyond that. For the first time in years, Maggie felt like someone saw her whole. Not the broken version of herself, not the version who had given up, but the woman who had fought through the storm and come out stronger. Adrian wasn't just seeing her. He was admiring her. "I didn't think I could ever be this free," Maggie whispered, looking up at him. "I didn't think I could ever move on." Adrian's eyes softened as he gazed at her, his voice steady. "You've always had the strength, Maggie. I just helped you remember it." Later that afternoon, as they walked through the square, Maggie spotted Daniel. He was standing near a shop window, his eyes empty and hollow, watching them from a distance. She didn't flinch. Her heart didn't race. Daniel wasn't the man she had built her life around anymore. He was just a man in the past, a memory fading into something insignificant. But then she saw Tessa. She entered the square, her heels clicking against the pavement, her eyes scanning the crowd. When she spotted Daniel, she immediately walked toward him, her usual arrogance radiating. Maggie's lips curved into the faintest smile. She wasn't surprised. Tessa was always quick to stake her claim on whatever she thought she could take. Suddenly, Maggie's phone buzzed in her pocket. A headline: "Tessa Monroe arrested in Florida for credit card theft." Maggie read the article, a quiet satisfaction settling over her. Tessa had been caught. Her greed finally catching up to her. Maggie couldn't help but feel a sense of justice, knowing that this was the inevitable consequence of someone so consumed by self-interest. Adrian glanced at her, noticing the flicker of something in her expression. "Karma's a bitch, isn't it?" he remarked softly. Maggie chuckled lightly, shaking her head. "I guess it is." The next day, as Maggie sipped her coffee, she saw Daniel standing at the end of the driveway. His eyes were desperate, his posture slumped. He was finally realizing the truth. His world had crumbled, and there was no turning back. Maggie leaned back, her chest heavy with the finality of it all. She didn't need to fix him. She didn't need to fix anything. "You called me too old for love," she whispered softly to herself, a smile tugging at her lips. "Turns out, I was too good for you." The garden was alive with color, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows as Maggie knelt beside Adrian, planting flowers in the soil. The air smelled faintly of earth and fresh greenery, and the quiet between them felt comfortable, grounding. It wasn't about grand gestures or sweeping declarations. It was in the small, simple moments, the shared glances, the laughter, the way their hands naturally found each other. Adrian worked beside her, his calm presence a stark contrast to the storm of emotions she'd lived through for so long. They didn't need to speak often. Their connection was enough. And, in this stillness, Maggie felt herself returning to a version of herself she hadn't seen in years, a version that was whole, that was confident. "I never thought I'd find peace again," Maggie said quietly, adjusting a flower in the soil. She looked up at Adrian, who smiled back at her. "I thought I'd always be stuck in that life." "You were always stronger than you knew," Adrian replied, his voice low but warm. "You just needed to remember." Maggie smiled, feeling something shift inside her. Adrian didn't just see her, he recognized her. He wasn't here to fix her, he was here to see her flourish. Weeks passed, and Maggie's world continued to change. Olivia, once withdrawn and uncertain, was slowly becoming the woman she had always been. The woman Maggie had lost sight of in the wake of Daniel's betrayal. There were still moments of quiet togetherness. Dinners, walks, the occasional long conversation. But Olivia had grown into someone proud of her mother, someone who saw the strength in Maggie that was too often hidden in the past. And Maggie, for the first time, felt like she could show up fully, not as a mother who was struggling to hold it all together, but as a woman who was confident, at peace with herself. Maggie's phone buzzed one afternoon. It was Rose. The divorce was final. Daniel had nothing but his car. Maggie didn't feel victorious. She felt calm. There was no elation, no sense of triumph. There was only a quiet sense of relief that she had finally closed that chapter. A few days later, Maggie stood on the porch of the house that had once been her home. The memories of it were thick, woven into every corner, every room. She had lived here with Daniel for years, but now the house seemed foreign. The pain she'd once felt when she thought of leaving was gone. It was time to let go. Maggie closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you for freeing me." She didn't need this house to hold on to the past. It was just walls and floors now. What mattered was what she had built. A new life, free from the weight of old mistakes. As she turned and walked away, she felt lighter, like a burden had been lifted. Adrian was waiting for her just down the path. She knew where she was going now, and it was forward. The rooftop restaurant buzzed with the soft clink of glass and muted laughter as Maggie stepped out of the elevator, her eyes adjusting to the warm, ambient light of the evening. The city skyline stretched out before her, the lights twinkling like stars in a darkened sky. But it wasn't the city she noticed first. It was the way she felt. Light. Free. The weight of the past, the years of longing and hurt, had fallen away. She was different now. The woman who had once been broken was gone, and in her place stood someone strong, someone sure of herself. Adrian stood beside her, his presence calm but strong. His hand was warm in hers, a quiet reassurance that she was not alone. Maggie glanced up at him with a small smile, and he smiled back, as if he already knew what she was feeling, the quiet pride in how far she had come. They moved toward the entrance of the restaurant, where Olivia waited for them, her face bright with excitement. "Mom," Olivia said, her voice filled with pride. "You look amazing." Maggie smiled back, the glow from her daughter's admiration filling her with warmth. It wasn't just the way Olivia spoke, but the way she looked at her now. There was no distance, no hesitation. Maggie had finally become the woman her daughter always knew she could be. The family had gathered to celebrate Olivia's recent promotion, a milestone that Maggie had cheered on with all her heart. It was a night of celebration, of new beginnings, but it also held a quiet tension in the air. Daniel was here too, though Maggie had little expectation of his presence. He was there for Olivia, of course, but that didn't mean he was ready to face the woman he had discarded so easily. As they entered the main dining area, Maggie felt the eyes of the room on her. It wasn't just the family, it was everyone. She had walked through life for so many years with the weight of Daniel's dismissal, his lack of attention. But now, the gaze of the room was different. They weren't looking at her out of pity or judgment. They were seeing her, truly seeing her. And she realized, with a quiet thrill, that it felt good. Maggie and Adrian were greeted with warm smiles, but it was the sight of Daniel that caught her eye first. He was seated at a table by the window, his posture stiff, his face pale as he watched her enter. It wasn't just his surprise that struck her. It was the faint flicker of regret, of something else, a recognition of the woman he had lost. He had always been the center of his own universe, his ego the lens through which he viewed everyone around him. But now, as Maggie walked in hand with Adrian, it was clear. The center had shifted. Maggie and Adrian made their way to the table where Olivia waved them over. As they approached, the entire room seemed to fall silent, the hum of conversation dying down as everyone turned their attention to her. It was subtle, but Maggie could feel it. The shift, the admiration, the acknowledgement of her transformation. Daniel's face drained of color as his eyes locked with hers, his expression a mixture of disbelief and something that could have been regret, though he was too proud to show it fully. Maggie met his gaze, steady, calm, a quiet strength radiating from her. When she reached the table, she didn't hesitate. She wasn't the woman who had spent years clinging to his approval. She wasn't the woman who had begged for his love. She had moved forward, and she knew, without a doubt, that he could never go back. "You called me too old for love," she said, her voice steady, each word landing like a quiet declaration. "Meet the man who proved you wrong." There was a beat of stunned silence. Daniel's lips parted, but he didn't know what to say. His world was crashing down in front of him. But it wasn't because of Maggie. It was because of the choices he had made. Choices that had led him to this point, to this table, with Maggie no longer looking back. Adrian stepped forward, a protective hand resting gently on Maggie's back. There was no arrogance in his posture, no need for confrontation. But there was something deeply satisfying about watching Daniel flinch at the unspoken strength of the man standing beside Maggie. And then, Maggie did something that would seal the moment for her. She turned her back on Daniel, walking to the center of the room where a dance floor had been set up. Adrian followed her without hesitation. She didn't need to look back. She didn't need him to apologize. She was free. As the music played softly, Maggie and Adrian moved together, their steps in perfect sync. Her laughter, light and unburdened, echoed in the space, and the room seemed to brighten as she spun in Adrian's arms. She had finally reclaimed herself, not just for Olivia, but for the woman she had become. Daniel sat alone at his table, his shoulders slumped, watching her dance, watching her live. The final shot of the night. Daniel, isolated in his failure. Maggie, radiant in her rebirth, dancing freely in the glow of the life she had made. The past was gone, and the future was waiting.